If you have questions, please fold them up and hold them up, and people will come and pick them up. And Jeff is back there. Jeff's going to pick out the questions today. If you've never done Ask Pastor Tim before, he tries to pick the questions that he thinks will have the broadest appeal. Jeff, by the way, is celebrating his birthday today. Yeah. And he was the sound guy today. So if it's a little loud for you, it's because he's got those old rock and roll ears he can't hear anymore. And but it's just the way it is. So I know Jeff's got a few questions to get us started. We had some really good ones all weekend long, so we may repeat a few of those, but we want to get at yours as well. So I'll let Jeff get started.
All right, the first one comes from a young person, age 11. How do you know God is real?
All right, that's a great question. How do you know God is real? So for me, I'll just talk about for me, a lot of the different ways that I experience God's presence. First of all, for me, I can't help but be outside and see the majesty of creation, from the smallest of little insects to the biggest mountains and oceans, and not be moved by that. And even though I have no problem believing that God used evolution to create the world, even all of that, no matter how far you bring it all back scientifically, at some point, there's a beauty and a majesty and an intricacy about creation that suggests there had to be somebody bigger behind it than just dumb luck. And so when Jan and I were on vacation, we were by the ocean, and we went out and did some pictures one day. Jan loves to take pictures, and we were up on a big cliff and just watching the force of this water hitting up against these cliffs, and just knowing how that water wears away, and the majesty and power of that water. And we had a chance to see some whales breach. And when you see a whale come up out of the water, it's a spiritual experience. So I know that God exists because of what I see in terms of creation. I know that God exists because of the miracles that I've seen in terms of the birth of my children. If you've ever been in a birthing room and seen a child birthed, there's something sacred about that. There's more than just DNA and all the stuff that happens. It's a G-rated show to make babies. As fun as that is, there's something magical about that. I see Jesus, I see God in people and the way that we worship together. But most of all, for me, I see God through the cross. And Jesus is real. We know that there's historic fact that backs up Jesus. And when you look at the story of Jesus and his death on the cross, his resurrection, that can only be attributed to the fact that God exists. And so the cross is the objective reminder of the existence of God and the love that God has for us. The empty tomb is the sign that God is alive and loves us. And then being in worship together, hearing God's word proclaimed, experiencing the tangible touch of God's grace every weekend through communion, all of those things together say to me that God exists, and it tells me what God is like, that God is loving and gracious. There are some people who argue that they look at the world, they see all this evil, and say, how can you believe in God and a loving God with all this evil? And it's a tough question. But at the same time, when you look at the goodness you see in the world, surprising acts of goodness, you have to ask, where did that goodness come from? And it has to come from a creator. And so all of those things for me say that God exists. And the more we immerse ourselves in that stuff, the bigger and more vibrant God becomes for us.
What's the impact of not having Church of Joy as our sister church?
There's not any impact on us. When we started this new church, we became our own entity. What Joy did was they gave us a gift of $50,000 to get us started. A number of us from the church came over. They gave us their blessing. It was not a church split. It was all very intentional. It was a good thing. And so they've had no financial support. We have our own separate board. We're a separate church. So we have no relationship other than the fact that it gave birth to us. And so it's like, Jeff always referred to it as the mothership. Okay? And so Mom has somewhat passed away, I guess, using that language. And so we're the children, the offspring of that church, as is Paul Sorensen's church, Hope Church, which meets over on the other side of the freeway somewhere. And so we become the legacy. But in terms of any impact, there is none. It's a good question, though. Thank you.
We often talk here about boys being in crisis, which they are. But what about our girls? How do we raise them to live in His image, to expect more of themselves, and to seek out Christian men?
Yeah, we talk a lot about boys, partly because I am a guy, and because boys are in such crisis and nobody's talking about it. Everybody's talking about our girls in crisis. We have government agencies that deal with girls in crisis. We have no agencies that deal with boys and men in crisis. None, on any level. So we get a lot of energy around girls. So that's not to say that they're not important. It's just to say this is why we talk about boys so much, because nobody talks about the boy issues. However, we do talk a lot about girls here, and we do have a rite of passage program that we do for girls. The challenges that girls face in the 21st century are very different than what boys are facing. In many ways, and this will sound off a little bit, but in many ways, the challenges boys are facing, the crisis that boys are facing, is because they are missing out on educational opportunities. The challenges our girls are facing is that they are growing up in a plethora of opportunities, and they're being overwhelmed by them. And we need to help our girls navigate this new world that's still emerging. It's a very different world than what my mother was raised in. My daughter is an inheritor of it, but it's my granddaughters and our young daughters right now who are really growing up in a world where there's just too many choices. And one of the things that we've raised our girls to do, and it wasn't intentional, is we've told our girls, you can be anything you want to be. No, you can't. You can only be what God created you to be. That's the truth. You can't be anything. You can't be everything. And our girls are being raised under this pressure that they have to be everything and do everything. And no human being can do that. And so what we need to do is to help our girls discover who God created them to be, to chase their passion, to be who God wants them to be. And as we help mold them and shape them in that, and to hear the voice of Jesus, that's how we help our girls. And it's the same for our boys, but we have to inspire our boys to greatness, because our boys are being raised in a world where men tend to be dismissed, and where boys tend to be downplayed, and they don't have a lot of gifts to bring to the table. And so that's a different discussion. So I care passionately about both. I have 2 granddaughters. I have 3 grandsons. I have 1 daughter. I have 1 son. This is all very important, but there's been a lot of energy around boys because nobody talks enough about boys. But girls are on the radar for me all the time, and we've done some various things throughout the years to deal with that. And our Rite of Passage program is one great program for that.
What advice do you have for agnostics? And will you ever do a special sermon or small group or study for those of us who are still exploring or questioning our faith?
Well, a couple things I would say to agnostics. First of all, I'd say the fact that you're here says a ton. And the fact that you're searching and seeking says that this is important for you. So some things that I would say. If you really want to know about God, if you want to know about Jesus, you want your questions answered, the best way to do this is to hang out where God's hanging out. And that's to, first of all, hang out with some Christian people and to be able to talk to them. Why do you believe in Jesus? And when you hang out with Christian people, you discover this is really messy stuff. It's been hard for me to be perfect, but for the rest of you, it's messy stuff. We're all messy, right? And so the reason why Christianity is so important is because it deals directly with messy people. God delights in messy people. God only saves messy people. So you hang out with messy people and you find out, well, why do you believe this stuff? Why is it important to you? And you hear stories that begin to capture your soul. When you're in worship, like you are here, and you get to hear these kinds of discussions, and you hear the story of Jesus as we've been walking through that story in the Gospel of Luke, and you're just enveloped by faith stuff, it's an opportunity for God to reach into your soul. I'll dare say, even though you're agnostic, by receiving the sacraments, and in some churches they tell you not to do it because you're not a believer, and I would say because you're not a believer, God gives a gift of grace to you through the sacraments, so come on up and enjoy it. It's through the sacraments that God begins to work in your heart. So those are reading the Bible. For those of you who really want to get into the intellectual side, read people like C.S. Lewis. His book, Mere Christianity, is a great place to start, or Tom Wright's book. Tom Wright has written several books and has done some great stuff on this. Now, in terms of doing a class, it's an intriguing idea. I love to do this kind of stuff, and so give me a kick in the pants and we'll set something up. And, I just think hanging out with people and answering questions is really important, so I would love to do that. So write me an email, and let's see what we can do to make that happen.
How do you start a conversation about faith with a non-believer?
What's wrong with you? All right, that's not the way. Okay. I think you start all of that stuff by just praying for the person. And you got to know when the moment's right. God is not one who is just going to force himself. God wins people to use romantic language, which I don't always do, woos people with grace, okay? Entices people with grace. And so it's not our job to force God on people, but it's the Spirit of God to use, it's God's job to use us through the power of the Spirit to once in a while plant some seeds. So I would always start with prayer, and to pray for a softening of the person's heart, an openness to faith, an openness for you to be a person of faith, and to be gracious. The best way to talk about your faith is to live your faith. That doesn't mean to be perfect, but it does mean to be gracious, to be kind, to be open, to be honest, to be authentic, whatever that means for you, and to model by your life. And hopefully, the best way the conversation starts is the person starts it. It says, you've got something. What is it? Tell me about it. One great way to open a conversation is if the person ever comes to you with a concern of some sort, somebody's sick or this is happening at work, and just to very simply say, I'll pray for you this week. And let it go at that. And then maybe a week later, just say, how are you doing? I've been praying for you. Tell me how you're doing. Those are great ways to just open the door. But don't go barging in, uninvited, to the dance and say, let's talk. Pray for those moments and then be open to the Spirit of God to use them when they open up.
The final question, what is the one question that you would ask God?
So I've been asked this one every service, and so I'll just basically give you the answer I've given at every service. For number one, the question changes week to week. Right now, the question is, why are these people running for president? That's the question I'm asking God right now. Is this the best we can do? Or maybe I'll expand on that. What's wrong with us? Really? You get what you pay for, I guess. There are a lot of questions, but my sense is, and I said this all the other services, I think finally when I get to heaven, I may look around and ask, well, how did you get here? I'll see some of you and say, how did you get here? I may ask that question. But basically, I think once I see Jesus, and am finally in the light of that full-on grace, there won't be any questions. I think I'm just going to fall flat on my face and say, wow. Behind that wow might be, how did I get here? But wow. And I just think it's not about it all making sense. It's not about having every question answered. I just think we're going to be in the presence of everything. In the presence of the all-knowing one, the all-wise one, the all-gracious one, and it will just wipe away anything that causes consternation, that causes pain or hurt, and we'll just be so gobsmacked we'll fall on our face and say, wow. So I think that's probably what's going to happen. But I do have questions I ask him from time to time while I'm here. And sometimes I get answers, and a lot of times I don't. And that's why grace is so important. Because when we live in the middle of grace, it gets us through the questions that we have. So with that, let's stand and confess together our faith. In the words of the Apostles' Creed.